All right, you're back with the location score, lads, and we are talking the percentage of renters compared to owner-occupiers, or quite simply, how many renters in the suburb. And it's an interesting stat, isn't it, Jeremy, because the owner-occupiers are generally 70% of the market, generally, and 30% renters. But this measure gives you an indication of the desire and the status that comes from a suburb, because if it's too high in one way or too low in another, it means totally different things, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, to me, it's an indicator of supply. As a property investor, I don't want to be competing with a whole lot of other property investors. So I want a lower proportion of renters, because that means there's a lower proportion of investors. And owner-occupiers take greater care of their property. They don't mind over-capitalising on their property, whereas an investor, it's all about return on investment. So you'll find that heavy concentration of owner-occupiers in a location will mean that the properties preserve their value a little bit better, and you've got less competition from other landlords.
And I reckon the perfect example of that is mining towns. So when you actually see a boom-bust cycle in the mining area, you actually see in those markets, it's almost 70% is investor and only 30% owner-occupier. So once the mining boom slows down and the jobs aren't there, we're basically left to see who's there, who's exposed to that. So there's a glut of investors trying to find that random tenant. So values collapse, rents collapse in those areas. Now that's the extreme case where it's completely flipped on its head. But I'm with Jeremy in the sense that I don't want to be investing in an area where there's hundreds of other investors coming into that area seduced by just a yield number, because ultimately, they don't have care for the property. I mean, they're renting it in most of those lower socioeconomic areas. So I really do. I call it the lifestyle test. We talk about it on the podcast and a few other things, but that's really important to understand, isn't it?
And it's not just about those regional towns. That's a good example, but also in our cities, where you have a massive unit oversupply, you'll find that you can get a very high percentage of renters in the unit market, but in the house market, it might be all owner-occupiers. So it's not just confined to regional areas, but cities can suffer too.
I guess it needs to be taken into consideration with the vacancy rate also, isn't it? Because if you've got a higher percentage of renters, but the vacancy rate is very, very low, it's still a good indicator of demand. But like you say, you've got to overlay that with the type of product, if it's a house versus if it's a unit. But ultimately, because if you think on the flip side, if it's too low as an investor, you're worrying if there's enough renters in that market. But it's not always the case, because if it is really low but the suburb has the right status, it just means that there'll be few properties being competed for, which will have an upwards pressure on the rents that you're getting.
I think you bang on by comparing it with the vacancy rate. You need to look at obviously multiple variables, even not just these two, but these two in concert are much more powerful than just looking at one on its own.
So do you, as a rule of thumb, and I know it's niche specific, but do you have a rule of thumb of what you're looking for in terms of that percentage?
Yeah, something like 25% or less I think is healthy. Obviously you want it to be as low as possible, and anything above about 50% would be triggering alarm bells for me. But like you say, if the vacancy rate is very low and the proportion of renters is at least reasonable, then it's not necessarily a problem area. But you do want to avoid areas that are completely dominated by investors.
Just come back to your example around that high density accommodation that may have been sold to all interstate investors. What's the first thing we would absolutely liquidate if our financial situation would change? We're getting out of that property, aren't we? So if there's an economic downturn, we don't have enough cash to look after ourselves. So all of a sudden we're going to fire sale that unit. And all of the other people in that block are going to be caught up in that fire sale or that rush to the door. And so that's obviously, because this is all about capital growth, don't forget that. So if we're trying to find that capital growth, this is another important indicator with vacancy rates as well.
And with the DSR data, how have you captured that data? Is it you found it easy to find? Is it because ABS published some of that?
That's
but have
right,
you found it to be reliable?
Well, at the time of talking, it's February 2017, so we're about 6 years since the last census. It's all based on census data. The ABS, it's very easy to get information from the ABS, of course, so I like that part about it. However, they don't have two categories, owner or occupier. They have about 9 different categories. And so there's some interpretation that's involved on what is meant by this category. Can you put that in the renter proportion, or has it got to be owner-occupier? And people filling out the census may be equally as confused as I am sometimes reading their column labels.
Come on.
So it can be a little bit unreliable now that we're a decent distance away from the last census. So a market could have changed significantly since then.
So bring on the new census.
Yeah.
Only a few months away, let's hope
But that's
so.
a good tip though, isn't it, Ben? That the further the daylight between the most, the census that they're basing on.
The reliability of the data.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there you go, folks. If you're interested in doing your property research, that's all you need to know about the percentage of renters versus owner-occupiers.